Yul Brynner stood motionless in the smoky interior of Musso and Frank Grill, watching Lee Van Cleef practice his theatrical quick-draw routine for impressed tourists and Hollywood wannabes, knowing that some men confused screen villainy with authentic danger, while others had learned to embody menace through experiences that entertainment industry publicists preferred to keep buried in classified files. March 1965, 7:30 in the evening, when Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More had transformed Van Cleef from supporting character actor into international symbol of cinematic evil, and Hollywood's most celebrated villain was about to discover the vast difference between performing Menace and living it. If you're fascinated by untold stories where manufactured screen personas collided with authentic authority that had been forged in circumstances too dangerous for most actors to survive, subscribe for more hidden moments where Hollywood's greatest villains learned painful lessons about the difference between acting evil and meeting real menace. The legendary Musso and Frank Grill had served as Hollywood's unofficial headquarters since 1919, where stars and industry power brokers gathered in red leather booths to conduct business requiring privacy and discretion. The restaurant's dim lighting and mahogany-paneled walls created an atmosphere where conversations could range from casual gossip to career-destroying revelations. Lee Van Cleef commanded the corner booth like a newly crowned emperor, displaying his authority to subjects who had previously dismissed him as merely competent supporting player. At 40 years old, he had finally achieved the international recognition that had eluded him through decades of reliable but unremarkable performances in countless westerns, where his distinctive angular features had been relegated to generic villain roles. But Sergio Leone had transformed Van Cleef's career limitations into assets, recognizing that his hawk-like nose and piercing eyes could convey the kind of calculated evil that separated memorable antagonists from forgettable heavies, who existed only to be defeated by heroic protagonists in predictable confrontations. The success of For a Few Dollars More had provided Van Cleef with something he had never possessed during his years as Hollywood supporting player: genuine star power based on international acclaim rather than domestic tolerance for reliable professionalism. The secret, Van Cleef was explaining to his captive audience of junior agents and aspiring actors, is understanding that evil doesn't announce itself through obvious theatricality. Real villainy operates through controlled menace that suggests capabilities the audience can imagine but hopes never to encounter. His analysis of screen evil was delivered with the authority of someone whose recent success had convinced him that artistic breakthrough represented genuine insight into the nature of authentic menace rather than fortunate casting in roles that suited his physical characteristics. "Take my quick-draw technique," Van Cleef continued, his hand dropping to the custom holster he wore even during social occasions, apparently convinced that his screen persona required constant reinforcement through theatrical accessories that reminded everyone of his newfound international reputation. Most actors approach gunfighter roles through speed alone, trying to impress audiences with rapid movement that looks exciting but lacks the psychological depth that separates genuine menace from mere athletic ability. He demonstrated his technique with the kind of flourish that characterized performers who had confused audience appreciation with professional validation, his weapon appearing in his hand with practiced smoothness that impressed observers who lacked experience with authentic gunfighting skills. But real evil operates through timing rather than speed, Van Cleef explained, apparently unaware that his analysis was being overheard by someone whose background included experiences that most Hollywood actors couldn't imagine and wouldn't survive if they encountered them in real-world applications. "The most effective villains are those who draw their weapons with deliberate precision that suggests complete confidence in their ability to dominate any situation through superior skill, combined with psychological authority that makes opponents doubt their own capabilities before physical confrontation even begins." The lecture was delivered with increasing confidence as Van Cleef warmed to his favorite subject, the artistic principles that he believed had transformed him from competent character actor into international symbol of cinematic menace. "Speed without psychology is merely athletic demonstration," Van Cleef concluded with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical understanding had been validated through commercial success and critical acclaim. but controlled menace that combines technical skill with genuine understanding of how fear operates. That's what separates memorable screen villains from forgettable supporting players. That's when the conversation took an unexpected turn that would be remembered by everyone present as education, about the difference between performing evil and embodying authentic menace that had been developed through circumstances where mistakes carried permanent consequences rather than script revisions. Interesting theory, came a quiet voice from the adjacent booth, carrying the kind of controlled authority that made casual conversations sound like tactical assessment. Though I suspect your understanding of authentic menace might be limited by experience that includes only entertainment applications, rather than situations where psychological authority serves purposes beyond audience appreciation. Van Cleef turned toward the source of the interruption, his expression shifting from confident superiority to careful evaluation as he recognized the man who had been sitting close enough to overhear every word of his performance without announcing his presence or revealing his assessment of the theories being discussed. Yul Brynner rose from his booth with movements so controlled they seemed to defy normal physical laws, his compact frame radiating the kind of density that made larger men feel suddenly inadequate, despite their supposed advantages in size and reach. "Mr. Brynner," Van Cleef replied with the careful courtesy that characterized his interactions with industry figures whose reputation extended beyond normal Hollywood boundaries into territory where authority was earned through methods that entertainment biographies preferred not to examine too closely. "I didn't realize you were dining here this evening. I hope my discussion of screen technique wasn't too elementary for someone whose experience with Western roles is considerably more extensive than my own." The diplomatic response was designed to acknowledge Yul's superior status while maintaining Van Cleef's recently acquired confidence in his own theoretical understanding of how menace operated in professional entertainment contexts. "Not elementary," Yul replied immediately, moving closer to Van Cleef's booth with steps that carried the precision of someone whose movement had been weapon as well as locomotion. "Simply incomplete. Your analysis of screen villainy demonstrates solid understanding of how audiences respond to theatrical menace, but it reveals limited experience with authentic psychological authority that operates beyond entertainment requirements." The assessment was delivered without insult or condescension, simply professional evaluation from someone whose background included circumstances where theoretical knowledge had to be validated through practical application under conditions that most people couldn't survive. "I'm curious about your claim to be Hollywood's fastest evil draw," Yul continued, his tone remaining conversational while carrying undertones that suggested genuine interest rather than casual skepticism. "That's quite a reputation to establish based on entertainment applications rather than situations where speed serves purposes beyond impressing audiences who will never face similar circumstances themselves." Van Cleef's confidence faltered slightly as he recognized that his recent success was being evaluated by someone whose authority in Western roles was unquestioned throughout the industry, and whose background included elements that official biographies preferred to minimize or ignore entirely. "Well, obviously I'm speaking in terms of professional capability rather than claiming any kind of real-world expertise," Van Cleef replied carefully, understanding that he was being maneuvered into territory where his theoretical knowledge might be tested against practical standards that his experience hadn't prepared him to meet. "Of course, Yul agreed with something that might have been approval. Though I'm curious whether your understanding of evil extends beyond character portrayal into comprehension of what authentic menace actually requires when circumstances demand capabilities that entertainment training doesn't provide." The question hung in the smoky air between them like a challenge that couldn't be ignored without losing face in front of witnesses whose opinions could affect Van Cleef's carefully constructed reputation as Hollywood's newest symbol of international villainy. "Are you questioning my understanding of what makes effective screen menace?" Van Cleef asked, his voice gaining an edge that revealed wounded pride fighting against rational assessment of situations where retreat might represent wisdom rather than cowardice. "I'm questioning your understanding of what makes authentic menace," Yul corrected gently, his tone suggesting that the distinction was more important than Van Cleef might realize. "Screen evil operates through techniques designed to impress audiences who expect to be entertained rather than educated about genuine psychological authority that serves purposes beyond theatrical effect." Instead of responding verbally, Van Cleef allowed his right hand to drift toward his holster, with movements designed to suggest readiness for confrontation that would demonstrate his capabilities through direct application rather than theoretical discussion. "Careful," Yul said quietly, his voice dropping to barely above whisper level that somehow carried more authority than shouted commands ever could. "Some demonstrations can't be undone once they've been initiated, and you might discover that authentic Menace operates according to rules that entertainment industry experience hasn't taught you to understand or survive." But Van Cleef's recently acquired international reputation required defense through methods that his theoretical knowledge suggested would establish his credibility as genuine authority figure rather than mere performer whose success was limited to controlled entertainment environments. His hand completed its movement to his weapon with dramatic flourish that impressed audiences but revealed complete inexperience with situations where speed served purposes beyond visual effect. What happened next lasted perhaps 2 seconds but would be remembered by everyone present as education about the vast difference between theatrical menace and authentic authority developed through experiences that most people couldn't survive. Yul's weapon appeared faster than conscious thought could follow, faster than normal human perception could track, faster than should have been possible. The motion was so rapid that it seemed to bypass normal physical laws entirely, creating the visual impression that the gun had materialized through magic rather than speed that exceeded normal human capability. But more devastating than the speed was the placement. Instead of pointing his weapon in Van Cleef's general direction, Yul had positioned the barrel against Van Cleef's forehead with surgical precision, creating contact between cold steel and warm skin, while Van Cleef's own draw was still incomplete. 0.2 seconds, announced Tommy Martinez, his voice carrying awe at performance that exceeded theoretical limits of human capability. Van Cleef stood frozen with his weapon halfway to firing position, his face showing shock at demonstration of superiority so absolute that comparison became meaningless. The legendary sneer that had made him famous in European theaters was replaced by genuine fear as he confronted reality that his screen persona bore no relationship to authentic menace. His hands began trembling uncontrollably, not just from physical shock, but from the profound psychological impact of discovering that his understanding of masculine authority had just been demolished through contact with capabilities his Hollywood experience had never prepared him to encounter. "Some men perform evil for audiences who expect to be entertained," Yul whispered, the gun barrel remaining pressed against Van Cleef's forehead with unwavering precision. "Others embody menace that serves purposes beyond theatrical effect. The difference becomes apparent when performance meets reality." Van Cleef tried to speak but found his voice trapped between outrage and terror as he confronted forces that his theoretical understanding hadn't prepared him to handle. "Your fastest evil draw reputation is based on entertainment applications where speed serves visual effect rather than survival necessity," Yul continued. "But authentic menace operates according to different rules, developed through circumstances where failure meant death rather than script revision." The education lasted 30 seconds, but its impact would resonate through Van Cleef's remaining career and fundamentally alter his understanding of screen authority versus authentic capability. When Yul holstered his weapon with the same impossible speed, Van Cleef remained motionless while sensation returned to extremities, paralyzed by contact with genuine menace rather than performed villainy. His famous angular features, which had conveyed calculated evil to audiences across Europe, now showed the hollow expression of someone whose entire professional identity had been revealed as elaborate performance art when confronted by authentic authority that operated beyond theatrical boundaries. Years later, Van Cleef would describe that evening as educational rather than humbling, though he never provided specific details about what had occurred during his conversation with Yul Brynner at Musso and Frank Grill. "I learned that there's a difference between playing villains and meeting authentic menace," Van Cleef would tell interviewers who asked about his evolving perspective on screen authority. "Some capabilities can't be learned through acting technique because they require experiences that most people couldn't survive and wouldn't want to attempt." The cryptic response satisfied journalists who were more interested in quotable philosophy than dangerous specifics. but those who knew both men understood that something significant had been settled that March evening through methods that transcended normal Hollywood competition into territory where authentic authority was demonstrated rather than performed.